Welcome to Singapore, an island city-state located off of southern Malaysia, known for its ethnically diverse culture, impressive economic growth, and picturesque temples. The island of Singapore was known to the mariners at least by the 3rd century AD. By the 7th century, when many mariner city-states arose, Singapore was probably a trading post serving between the Malay archipelago. The origin of the name Singapore comes from a myth that in the 14th century, a Sumatran prince landed on the island after being at sea in a thunderstorm. Upon arriving, he spotted a lion or a great beast in the distance. Side note, however, studies verified that lions never lived in Singapore, and it is believed that he actually saw a Malaysian tiger. He called the island Singapura, Singa meaning lion, and Pura meaning city. Throughout the 13th and 14th century, the island saw various regional powers vying for control over it. As time progressed and power shifted, Singapore became a part of the Malacca Sultanate. Now, you're probably wondering when the Europeans come in colonizing and conquering everything, but surprisingly they actually didn't. Nope, just kidding. The Portuguese seized the island in 1511, and the island still remained under the Sultanate's control. The Portuguese later destroyed the Malay settlements in 1613, and the island fell into obscurity, remaining largely uninhabited. Now, again, you might be asking, is that it? There needs to be more to the story. And right you are again, my friend. Wow, you are on a roll. The British were extending their dominion into India and were also expanding trade with China. With this rapid growth happening, more ports were needed to refit, revitalize, and protect merchant fleets. Also, the British needed a bigger presence in the region to halt any advance of the Dutch in the East Indies. 3 islands were acquired for the purpose of being ports: Penang, Singapore, and Malacca, which was taken from the Dutch. In 1818, Lord Hastings, who was Governor General of India, gave approval to Sir Stamford Raffles to establish a trading station on the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. On January 29, 1819, Lord Hastings landed on Singapore after having surveyed other nearby islands. He made a treaty with Temenggong Abdur Rahman to set up a trading post there on the island. Singapore proved to be a prize settlement, and by 1820, the island was earning revenue, and 3 years later, its trade surpassed that of Penang. Singapore's status as a British settlement was made official with the creation of 2 new treaties. The first was a treaty that basically told the Dutch to find a new island because they belonged to the British. The second one was with Sultan Hassan and Temenggong Abdur Rahman, and they ceded the island to the British for increased cash payments and pensions. The 3 islands became the Strait Settlements in 1826 under control of British India, even though they weren't in India. Later, their status was raised to a crown colony under the jurisdiction of the Colonial Office in London, even though they were not in London. Well, with the advent of the steamship in the mid-1800s, trade between Europe and Asia increased tremendously, leading more people to need a convenient port. Also, with the development of rubber planting in the region, Singapore became a major sorting and export center of rubber. Before the close of the 19th century, Singapore was seeing unprecedented prosperity, and trade had expanded 8-fold between 1873 and 1913. With the economic growth came an influx of immigrants from areas around the region, such as China, India, and more. The population of the island rose from around 10,000 to 100,000. Just like all good things in life, however, it had to come to an end. And when a Japanese aircraft bombed the sleeping city in the early hours of December 8, 1941, Singapore fell to Japan on February 15, 1942, and was renamed to Shonan, which means Light of the South. It remained under Japanese control for 3.5 years before Japan was forced to relinquish it. British forces returned in September of 1945, and Singapore came under British military administration. The Strait Settlements were dissolved on April 2, 1946, and Singapore was now bolstered up to the position of a crown colony. Penang and Malacca, however, became part of the Malayan Union in 1946, later the Federation of Malaya in 1948, because they weren't making money, so the British were like, here, take it, we don't want it anyways. But post-war Singapore faced staggering problems of high unemployment, slow economic growth, and inadequate housing, which sparked anti-colonial and nationalist sentiments. The people of Singapore were like, not having any say in our country kinda sucks, so they pushed for more representation. Constitutional powers were initially vested in the governor, who had an advisory council of officials and nominated non-officials. This later evolved into separate executive and legislative councils in July of 1947. The governor retained firm control, but there was an election of 6 members to the Legislative Council by popular vote, marking the Singaporeans' first election held. But again, nothing good can last, and the Communist Party of Malaya tried to take over, causing a state of emergency to be declared in June of 1948. While this was going on in Singapore, constitutional talks were being held in London to decide what would happen with the city-state. After 12 years, the constitutional agreement was signed on May 28 of 1958, in London, giving Singapore self-government. In 1959, Singapore became a self-governing state within the British Empire. And in May that year, Singapore held their first general election and a new constitution was brought into force. Sir William Good became head of state, and the first prime minister was Lee Kuan Yew, who served until 1990. There is still a lot of tension between the communist groups and the elected PAP, People's Action Party, in 1961. Both groups decided to join the Federation of Malaya, unanimously declaring independence from Britain. Malaysia was formed in September of 1963 and consisted of the Federation of Malaya, Singapore, Sarawak, and North Borneo. This merger proved to be short-lived as different ideologies clashed and racial tensions sparked. Eventually, Singapore was separated from the rest of Malaysia on August of 1965, becoming a sovereign, democratic, and independent nation. They still hold diplomatic relations with Malaysia today, showing no signs of animosity towards each other. Singapore was admitted into the United Nations on September of 1965, with Yusof bin Ishak as the first president and Lee Kuan Yew as the prime minister. Now came the struggle for Singapore to survive and prosper on its own. They lacked a sense of national identity and a disparate population of immigrants. The plan was to take advantage of the strategic location and favorable world economy, and by 1972, a quarter of Singapore's manufacturing firms were either foreign-owned or joint venture companies, with the US and Japan being major investors. Singapore saw immense growth as they fostered new economic relations with other countries, opening new jobs and more government-funded projects. During the Cold War, Singapore remained neutral, instead deciding to focus efforts on uniting Southeast Asian countries under ASEAN. In 1990, Singapore, along with Hong Kong, was ranked as the two most important Asian financial centers just after Tokyo. Today, the tiny island country seeks diplomatic relations and is not afraid to speak out against more powerful nations, such as the US and China. With such a short history, the island still has much to learn, but Singapore has accomplished much as a young nation. Tell me in the comments what you think about Singapore, and if you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. As always, thank you for watching.